Before Napoleon left Paris to launch his army's military campaign in Belgium, he left behind what he considered to be a strong enough government, with trusted, long-serving ministers and staff in charge of keeping France politically stable during his absence. He entrusted the Minister of War post to the reliable and stern commander, Marshal Davout, who was not pleased with being left out of the upcoming campaign. Though his talents as a battlefield general were going to be sorely missed, his appointed role was essential to keeping France secure under his reputed no-nonsense leadership. In contrast, Napoleon reluctantly felt obliged to keep on as his Minister of Police, the very capable but notoriously deceitful Joseph Fouché, someone with a murderous history of casually orchestrating horrific mass executions of French civilians during the French Revolution. The Emperor and Fouché were well associated with each other, being allies in the 1799 coup d'état, the 18 Brumaire event. Napoleon rewarded Fouché for his role by having him in his service during the First Empire, effectively organizing the French secret police as a feared iron hand against the emperor's dissenters. The arrangement had many ups and downs, due to Fouché's consistent habit of deviously acting for the sake of his own ambitious schemes. Shortly after reclaiming the throne, Napoleon had suspected Fouché of being involved in an intrigue with Austrian officials, which sparked a one-sided angry confrontation between the two. Napoleon raged and berated Fouché, accusing him of being a traitor to his face. Fouché was unoffended and casually disregarded the incident. Right after when he left Napoleon in his room, he smugly remarked to one staff member outside, who overheard the verbal tirade. "He hasn't changed." Despite his serious misgivings, Napoleon chose to dare not remove Fouché from his minister position. A combination of reasons may have influenced Napoleon's gamble to keep Fouché in his post. The controversial minister was very accomplished in policing national security. The removal of such a prominent official could cause a sensational scandal, one that could weaken Napoleon's government. Making an enemy out of Fouché would be a dangerous option, as underhanded retaliation would surely result at some point. Even prior to Napoleon's invasion of Belgium, Fouché had quietly predicted that the bold military adventure would be ultimately doomed to fail, after achieving one or two victories. With that firm belief in mind, Fouché was already determined not to be caught unprepared. One person Napoleon had faith in was his brother, Joseph, who was now acting in the role of an envoy to Napoleon's Council of State in Paris. By the early morning of June 20, Joseph had received Napoleon's letters that were written and sent out just the day before, from Philippeville. Joseph read through the message contents that described the shocking French military disaster suffered at Waterloo. Following the letter's other directives, with specific instructions Napoleon had entrusted him to carry out, Joseph lost no time in calling together a council of the ministers, and informing them of the news of the defeat, and also, impressing upon them the expectation from their emperor, which urged them to remain strong together, and support his efforts to rebuild the army. The council showed its willingness to do just that. That is, all except for one culprit among them, who while acting in agreement with his colleagues, set about right after the council meeting was over, to begin clandestinely undermining and destroying whatever patriotism that Napoleon's supporters tried to muster in Paris, on behalf of the emperor. The dishonorable backstabber was none other than Fouché. He sought to entice a few key participants, in order for his new mastermind plot to succeed. He knew that several particular members among the chambers of representatives were susceptible to becoming his unwitting and willing accomplices, upon their receiving news of the French army's decisive defeat at Waterloo. Using this ominous situation now facing France, Fouché set his duplicitous plans into motion, to propel the downfall of the Emperor of France, and eventually promote his own ambitious aim to lead a subsequent French government. In his first bold move, Fouché quietly arranged the release of Eugene d'Arnoul, the Baron of Vitrolles, who Napoleon had arrested and imprisoned in Paris 2 months earlier, in the middle of April, for organizing royalist resistance against him, in the Toulouse area. Baron Vitrolles had also taken part, as an officer, in the victory of royalist troops over those loyal to Napoleon, in a significant clash, at Loriol, in southern France. An understanding was established between the two, whereby Vitrolles would lay low and close at hand during his freedom, until eventually called upon by Fouché to act as his envoy for discreet discussions with the Bourbons. Fouché spent the later day of June 20 and then going into the overnight hours, conducting secretive one-on-one personal interviews with specific susceptible ministers and members of the two chambers. The mastermind was setting the stage for a dramatic showdown that on face value would not appear to be a provocative act of rebellion or treason, but instead, an orchestrated build-up of insurmountable political opposition against Napoleon, and to resolve the grave national security crisis. Fouché aimed to control the resistance from the chambers, to avoid provoking a violent reaction from Napoleon's ministers, in particular, Marshal Davout. Although the war minister probably had other distractions at the same time, with his wife who was then 8 months pregnant. Among the selected representatives, with whom Fouché had conversations with, were, the Liberal Party leader, Lafayette, and 2 other officials Fouché was already personally acquainted with. The young Monsieur J. and Monsieur Mandel. Fouché lured these persons into the belief that they were among the very few representatives who could be trusted to speak out against Napoleon, as being a harbinger of doom. To inspire his co-conspirators' wrath against Napoleon, Fouché spoke out with his own condemnations. The reckless gambler has lost the art of winning. During the day of the 20th, the members in the Chamber of Representatives were predictably in an uproar upon the revelation of the horrendous news of the French army's near obliteration in Napoleon's short-lived campaign. The Chambers of Representatives President, Chantilly Longueuil, was very concerned. He was a dedicated Republican, and formerly the President of the French National Assembly during the midst of the Revolution. He then became a long-time outspoken critic of Napoleon's reign for over a decade. In early June, the Chamber of Representatives elected Longueuil to be its president. When Napoleon received this news, he flew into a rage, which was typical whenever he regarded himself as a victim of an unexpected betrayal. During his outburst, Napoleon exclaimed to his staff around him, "They wish to insult me by electing an enemy." He made a vicious threat to shut down the chamber, before being finally calmed down by those around him. Although the new constitution did allow Napoleon to approve or deny the chamber's choice of president, Napoleon did confirm the result, after having a mutually cordial meeting with Longueuil. Even still, Fouché exploited a fresh opportunity, as he quickly spread gossip of Napoleon's initial shutdown threat, desiring to agitate the representatives' fears of Napoleon striking against them. And so, 2 weeks after he gave assurances to Napoleon, towards a sincere collaborative understanding between them, the now formidable representatives' president began to reconsider his initial cooperative stance. The malicious gossip circulated by Fouché began taking an amplified effect. Throughout both chambers in the Legislative Assembly, the members' willingness to sacrifice Napoleon slowly became a growing reality, while at the same time, they convinced themselves that there would be no return of the Bourbons to replace the emperor. A somewhat near repeat of Napoleon's first downfall in 1814 was taking shape once again. The first stage of Fouché's devious plan was well underway. It was 5:30 in the morning, when Napoleon finally arrived back in Paris. He made his way to the Élysée Palace, looking disheveled, tired, and breathing with some difficulty. Although the past week of intense campaigning had taken its toll upon Napoleon's stamina, the French emperor was still energetic, preparing to appeal for more sacrifices from France. Arriving at the palace, Napoleon was first greeted by his good friend and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Armand Cour. Relaxing himself on a sofa, Napoleon remarked, "The thing was won, the army had performed miracles. Then, at the end of the day, a panic seizes them. I can't understand it. Ney went in, like a lunatic. He slaughtered all my cavalry. There's no more to say. I need 2 hours of sleep to enable me to set about business." Displaying some anguish, Napoleon clutched at his chest, expressing that he felt as if he was choking. When Napoleon inquired about the mood of the politicians, Cour confessed that many of them were against continuing the war. Napoleon still expressed his intent to conduct a Council of State session, and to also rally the 2 government chambers bodies. The more formidable challenges he expected to face would come from the unpredictable chambers of representatives, rather than from the more sedate chambers of peers members, each of whom he handpicked himself. Napoleon intended to win over all of them to gain their full support. They would be his last chance to turn around the stunning defeat into a near impossible far-fetched triumph. Cour remained unconvinced of the emperor's high hopes, further explaining to Napoleon, "News of your disasters has already transpired. The chamber will not act agreeably to your expectations. I'm sorry to see you in Paris, sire. It would have been better not to leave the army. That is where your strength lies and your safety." Napoleon then soberly confessed. "But I have no army left. I have nothing but fugitives. I've no guns." However, with unanimity, everything may be repaired. Count Lavalette, the French nation's general director of posts, and a good friend of the emperor, showed up at this time. Napoleon greeted him with a momentary breakdown, in the form of an exasperated laughing fit, before composing himself, and then inquiring further, about the political situation. Lavalette emphasized the dire prevailing mood among the representatives, and how much of their ongoing discussions were fixated upon the possibility of requiring Napoleon to abdicate, to resolve the national crisis. Not long after, Napoleon had rested and was refreshing himself, and while he was taking a bath, the Minister of War, Marshal Davout, also arrived to present himself and his own report of the state of affairs in Paris. Davout strongly suggested to Napoleon that the Assembly of Representatives should be immediately dissolved. Napoleon rebuffed the idea, declaring that he was still committed to acting within reason, as their constitutionally appointed ruler. But in fact, not 2 weeks earlier, prior to Napoleon leaving Paris to lead his army, he had debated with himself, on the point of whether to use his constitutional right to shut down the chambers while he was absent. He yielded to using restraint, despite his justifiable doubts. Napoleon went to his summoned council meeting, which commenced at 10 o'clock that morning. Among those present were his important ministers, his brothers, several generals, and many other officials in his Council of State. Napoleon's loyal secretary, Murat, the Duke of Bazeneau, commenced the meeting by reading out aloud Napoleon's bulletin that he had dictated while at Philippeville, describing the battle at Mont-Saint-Jean in detail, which also alluded to Marshal Ney being at some fault for the defeat. Napoleon then gave a patriotic speech to the audience, calling upon everyone to rally around him, and to continue the war, which he had started the week before. Among his choice words, spoken to the silenced and brooding listeners: "Our misfortunes are great. I have come to repair them, to impress upon the nation a great and noble devotion. The enemy will be crushed. I could seize power. But it would be more useful, and more national, if it were given by the chambers." Napoleon let it be known to his loyal followers in the council that he would challenge the chamber's officials to unite with him by choice, rather than intimidate, or even dispose of their own powers altogether. The council wholly agreed on the necessity to gain favor with the members of the chambers. Napoleon then invited the council to openly express their opinions. However, only a few of the prominent persons among them did speak their minds. Minister of Foreign Affairs, Caulaincourt, calmly proposed for a national effort to support Napoleon and continue the war. Minister of the Interior, Carnot, became emotionally moved, calling for the National Guard and militias to be mobilized and Paris to be placed under a state of siege. He further ventured that the chambers should be persuaded to position Napoleon in the role of a dictator. Minister of War, Davout, was more direct with his opinion. He maintained that negotiating with the chambers' assemblies would be a waste of time. He cited the specific article in the 1815 Additional Act, which would allow Napoleon to dissolve the chambers. Napoleon's brother Lucien strongly agreed with Marshal Davout. Although these two once very close brothers had an eventual falling out between themselves over the years, Lucien now presented a shadow of his former revolutionary self, seeking a repeat of the 18 Brumaire event, in which he played a prominent role in securing Napoleon's ambition to become sole leader of France. Once again, he believed that the chambers needed to be rendered powerless, even if by force. Napoleon pushed back against the insidious advice. "The nation did not send them to overthrow me, but to support me. I do not fear them. I shall still be the idol of the people and of the army. Were I to say a single word, they would be all knocked on the head. If we quarrel, instead of preserving a good understanding with each other, all will be lost." Adding his own concerns, Minister of the Navy, Admiral de Craye, who was also a member of the Chamber of Peers, reasoned that the Chambers of Representatives could not be trusted to support Napoleon during the current crisis. He noted their current hostile mannerisms. At this juncture, the Minister of Police, Joseph Fouché, now seized his opportunity to prey upon Napoleon's hesitancy to act aggressively. He postured himself calmly and positively, to contrast himself from his disgruntled colleagues, and their predominantly dire commentaries. He encouraged Napoleon to approach the chambers in good faith. Fouché likely calculated that this passive overture would make Napoleon appear weak to his critics in the representatives' chamber, and not someone to be feared, as was the case for 14 years, up until his exile to Elba. In accordance with his devious scheming, Fouché was carefully prodding the unsuspecting emperor straight into his trap. Vice President of the Council of State, Count Regnault, a solid supporter of liberal ideals, then added his own bold and startling viewpoint. He maintained that the chambers of representatives were in such a mood of despair that their only belief in the salvation of France rested upon Napoleon's abdication in favor of his son, and his distanced Austrian wife, Marie-Louise, taking over the French throne. This he further believed should at least satisfy the enemy coalition's leaders. The statement was too brazen for Napoleon to ignore. He responded with vigor by defending his own exalted reputation, which still existed with his loyal French army troops, who were rallying in greater numbers by the hour, in the Rhone region. Other passionate supporters included the growing mobs of excitable fédéré militiamen, loitering in and around Paris, who were openly voicing their own devotion for the emperor. Further deliberations then continued in the council, when suddenly, in the next moment, the meeting received a shocking interruption. It was as if the sky itself had just dropped on their heads. Upon learning that Napoleon was soon returning to Paris, the politicians of the Chamber of Representatives had gathered at their assembly hall, several hours before their doors were due to open at noon. Time was now of the essence. Fouché's recruited partners were among them, acting as his fearmongers. His calculated exaggerated rumors of a wrathful emperor returning to retake total control in the capital worked up the representatives into a boiling rage. This was the ongoing anarchy that Napoleon was warned about by his staff members, almost as soon as he had arrived back in Paris. The representatives had started their own assembly meeting by the time Napoleon's council was in session. The boldest among the representatives, being the liberals, revealed their true colors. They wanted to be free and independent as a nation, dispensing with the dynasties of the Bourbons and for some, even that of Napoleon. They feared any delay in their actions to assert themselves would allow Napoleon the opportunity to strike at them first, by dissolving the chambers. The more moderate voices of reason in the chamber sought to persuade Napoleon to voluntarily abdicate in favor of his son. The new ruler of France, by name, would be the boy, Napoleon II, even though he was being confined in Austria, along with his mother, still the French empress. More radical suggestions were offered, circumventing the constitution, and forcing Napoleon to abdicate by their decree. This was the farce that Fouché was engineering ever so carefully. He patiently manipulated his players and the played upon, putting them all on a basis of false footings. Even while he was attending the meeting, at the Élysée Palace, Fouché discreetly communicated messages to the agitated representatives. The distance between the two meeting halls was quite close, separated only by the River Seine. Fouché's latest dispatch of manipulative news claimed that Napoleon was in the council, preparing to imminently dissolve the chambers. This new alarm was too menacing to ignore. The representatives deliberated with vigor upon the three options remaining to act upon. The first, being desirable to the small but still significant Bonapartist faction, would compel the chamber to fully support Napoleon in a dutiful and patriotic effort, resulting in the ultimate defeat of the Allied armies. The second, which appealed to the minority of revolutionaries, would have the chamber resist any attempt by Napoleon to use his constitutional right to dissolve the chambers legally, and keeping power for himself, for the duration of the current national crisis. The third, agreeable to the liberal majority, would be to use their numbers and vote for proposals that would oblige Napoleon to give up his throne, as the means to convince the Allied powers to cease their invasion plans and discuss peace terms, the goal being to keep France independent and liberal in its politics. Fouché's unwitting main player, Lafayette, seized upon this turbulent moment to launch a well-prepared and quite drastic crusade. He made a sensational appeal to the frantic members surrounding him. They became silent as he gave guidance. "Gentlemen, I feel myself called on to speak to you of the dangers that threaten the country," he declared to the audience, a statement with 5 proposals. The opening one simply pointed out the obvious. The Chamber of Representatives declares that the independence of the nation is threatened. The second listed proposal was a defiant challenge against Napoleon, and was an action beyond the Constitution itself. It stated, The chamber declares itself in a state of permanence. Any attempt to dissolve it is a crime of high treason. Whoever shall be guilty of such an attempt will be a traitor to his country, and immediately condemned as one. The third initiative was an important message for the French army, reminding them to perform their duty solely in defense of the nation's independence. The Army of the Line and National Guard, who have fought, and still fight, in defense of the liberty, the independence, and the territory of France, have deserved well of their country. The fourth proposal was similar to the third, with its focus appealing to the loyalty of National Guards in Paris. They would protect the chamber representatives, in the event of a Bonapartist coup attempt to remove them. The Minister of the Interior is invited to assemble the principal officers of the Parisian National Guard, in order to consult on the means of providing it with arms, and of completing this corps of citizens, whose tried patriotism and zeal offer a sure guarantee for the liberty, prosperity, and tranquility of the capital, and for the inviolability of the national representatives. The fifth and final proposal was a demand made with an impudent tone, adding insult to the injury of the second proposal. The ministers of war, of foreign affairs, of police, and of the interior are invited to repair immediately to the sittings of the chamber. And then, another of Fouché's inside pawns, the representative, Henri Lacoste, another strong critic against Napoleon, spoke up in strong support of Lafayette's proposition. The overwhelming numbers of liberals and revolutionaries backed it as well. By the noon hour, the Chamber of Representatives had formally adopted all of Lafayette's resolutions. Self-congratulating applause erupted among them. It was these official proposals that were immediately sent by letter to Napoleon's council. As an extra precaution, the representatives had posted more National Guards around their assembly building. A copy of this momentous letter was then dispatched to the Luxembourg Palace, where the Chamber of Peers was also in session. Fouché, and the anti-Bonapartist representatives, now held an advantageous momentum. They each believed that the fate of France was in their own hands. However, it would soon become apparent that events in and around Paris were now racing beyond anyone's control.